Isaac's arc is a story in 4 parts.
One of the biggest narrative challenges I've ever faced is...
Dead Space 1 is Alien. Dead Space 2 is Aliens. Dead Space 3 is Fight Club. Dead Space 4 is Matrix. But the elephant in the room is that Dead Space 3 was not, as successful as Dead Space 1 and 2 for a variety of reasons.
Many reasons. I would redo Dead Space 3 almost completely. Do you want to leap into Dead Space 4 now?
Hi, it's me, Brian, and today I have a special video because I sat down once again with one of my best friends, Chuck Beaver. Chuck was the narrative director of much of the Dead Space series, Dead Space 2, Dead Space 3, a bunch of the transmedia, and he and I several months ago sat down and played through the entire Dead Space remake. And after we did our playthrough, we were talking for weeks about what is the story of Dead Space, and just decided to do a fun franchise exploration exercise where we talked through the narrative beats of the entire series, including some potential retcons to Dead Space 3, and from that what could potentially be the story of Dead Space 4. So whether you're a Dead Space fan or whether you're a narrative buff like us, I hope you enjoy this video. And we said this a million times throughout the video, but I just want to reiterate, this is just us having fun. This is not us making an official pitch of anything. This is just two narrative nerds talking about what gets us excited about game narrative. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe.
We should first discuss why we are here. Obviously, we did our playthrough of the entire Dead Space remake, which is where you and I first sat down together and we talked about all the lore and all the things as we played through the first Dead Space. But I think during that session, we were both saying, and you were saying a lot, there's so much to unpack just in terms of, because I think we talked a lot about the lore in those playthroughs, and we only touched on kind of Isaac's arc in small parts, but I think we wanted to do this dedicated talk to kind of talk through obviously all of Dead Space, including Dead Space 4, but then also talking more specifically about what is the story of Dead Space at its core, and who is Isaac at its core, and what is the story that Dead Space is trying to tell. Right.
Yeah, I think it gets a good recap, a franchise design recap.
Yeah,
is what I think would be good for us to just chat through from a narrative perspective.
Right,
without necessarily prescribing specific screenplays for some of the written or yet to be written episodes, but just laying it out and what you and I would do if we were helping the narrative brainstorm of that.
Right. We'll just do a recap of who you are, Chuck, the writer of all of the original Dead Space series. And
Right. Yeah. It's sort of, we had certainly, Anthony Johnston was the actual writer of Dead Space 1, and I was doing more production, and then as the series progressed and we changed out leadership and more creative control came to myself and Ben Monat, the creative director, we ended up writing more and more. And certainly we're doing all of the franchise planning, the lore planning, and then all the transmedia was all the treatments were by me and all that good stuff. All the other games, putting those in the timeline, that all fell to me. So we did. We were writing it by the end.
Because it's basically you and Ben, right, who were not only responsible for all of the games, but also a lot of the transmedia, some of they're comics and novels and.
Oh my God! Yes, comic books, two novels, 2 or 3 graphic novels, an iPhone game, all the Steve Papoutzes did the Wii game. We still had to help fit that storyline in, and then we had the DLCs that I'd written one of, and then actually both of them. No. So all that stuff had to get written.
What did I do?
Well, I just remember, because some other much better designers had written another DLC that we didn't use because there was no time, so we had to use the one that I had written, Severed, and then the end one in Dead Space 3 was what was supposed to be Dead Space 4, but we can talk about all that.
Yeah.
Because even though we wrote Dead Space 3 with the help of Sherry Priest, it just needs to we just need to talk about it.
Yeah, exactly. But there's learnings that have happened.
Yeah, there's a lot to discuss.
Yeah, and I think that's good to touch on is this conversation that we're going to have is not it is kind of a post-mortem-y, but it's also not to be we are obviously not going to be this is what everybody did wrong. It's more of just a narrative deconstruction, like you're saying, and knowing what has been learned from Dead Space 1, Dead Space 2, and Dead Space 3, if we now could go in front of a big whiteboard and say, let's plan the Dead Space franchise like they've done for, if you think of Marvel or something like that. What is the story we're trying to tell across these multiple different series and different properties? What is the ultimate goal that we're trying to say? and specifically when we talk about Dead Space, it's like, who is Isaac? What is his arc across not only individual games but the entire series? And then what is Dead Space as a whole trying to say?
That's a good perspective, because subsequent to Dead Space, I've been on many projects now where this level of franchise planning has been required. And had we known back then, because the Dead Space 1 success was a bit of a surprise.
Right.
And so we were like, oh, Dead Space 2. And so the lore wasn't necessarily set up to run an MCU phase. So now I know how to do that. So do you. And so it's fun to talk about that.
Right.
And then don't forget, like, a shout out to Motive, like their remake of Dead Space 1, the epic, fantastic remake. Like, they have the chance to do what they want with the franchise, so they actually can be having these conversations as well and enjoying themselves to death on what is the best next step for them, right? So this is in the same vein of that. Like, what a fun idea to reimagine a beloved franchise better, and like how would it be better served?
Exactly. And this is also not, we should also say that this is not us being like, Motive should do this. This is this is literally us. We just, because we're story nerds and we're best friends, and this is like all we talk about most of the time is just like not only Dead Space but just stories in general. Like, obviously when we're playing the fantastic Motive Dead Space remake and all that, we're just like, I was just asking you, like, what have you learned? And obviously people may have seen with the playthrough of like, you know, if you could do this again, what would you do? Or again, from the franchise perspective, like, what would be changed?
Plus, I think I want to consider what Motive did do on the remake, because they did a hugely great job of retconning a lot of the lore that was really messy and like trying to make sense of what came in Dead Space 1, 2, 3, and all the stuff. So they have really beautiful answers in there. I would want to just also contemplate that, like, oh, well, that's pretty smart. If we'd kept that and do that, what does it mean for this? What does it mean for that? Because I really enjoyed all their answers to some of the...
Yeah, they did a really great job.
Yeah.
And even, I think, we talked about this afterwards, but during our playthrough, because those last couple episodes where we did a live stream, and the chat was going so fast that like you were having trouble keeping up, and the writer of that was on the Motive team,
she chimed in. Joe Barry, I believe was her name.
She chimed in and she was answering some of our questions, but we missed them. And then afterwards we were like, oh wait, no, so we were like playing the game being like, oh man, I wish that they had addressed this. And she's in the chat like, we did
and she was answering in the chat and we just blew past it. I mean, talk about a missed chance. Sorry.
But yeah, really, really awesome job. We're both very happy with the Motive.
Yeah, that was a really an outstanding piece of update work. Like, that can go wrong in so many ways, and they really, really put a good foot forward for us to just talk about too.
The first thing to address is Isaac's arc is a story in 4 parts, right? Obviously, we've talked a lot about Dead Space 1, 2, and 3, but then there was always the aforementioned potential of Dead Space 4, which is something that y'all were working on at the time. But this is something that, again, in our whiteboard of being like, what is the story we're trying to tell? It was always 4 parts, correct? It was always kind of in your mind where it should go.
I think after we inherited Dead Space 2 and suffered with having to clean up the lore as best we could into a in-flight game, Dead Space 2, we were like, let's not make this mistake again if we're successful. Let's plan out. So Ben and I had sort of a papered craft version of what 3 and 4 would be, and I've always said I think Ben's version of what 4 is very different from mine. He would probably have had Ellie as the main character and all. I think it's very valid, and it'll be great because Ben's really creative. But yeah, we sort of had it planned out, but I think as I've gone into my career, I think it's sort of, my memory has gotten changed where I'm like, well, this is what we were planning. I think this is what I'm planning now, what I know about the way narrative works, and this is what I think would be a logical way for that to come out. So we had plans for it in case we were that successful. I don't know if they're what I'm about to discuss with you, but this is what I think it would be.
In retrospect, again, this is kind of like knowing what you know now. Like, this is probably how it would play out. If for some reason it was, it was back in time and, Visceral was still around, rest in peace. Whatever, right? Like, what would have happened?
But I think what you said is the key is, first of all, even the lens of how to view a franchise. Like, what is the driving force? And you literally just said it. This is Isaac's story in 4 parts. And anything that deviates from that is probably not great design. So find a hook, and we're going to say that's it. And let's get into it. We're going to talk about, well, if that's true, then what are the log lines of each of the 4 properties? Right?
Exactly.
1, 2, 3, 4. If it's Isaac's journey, I can kind of break down what that is.
Yeah. And so I think if like, again, like say the Dead Space series was a log line, like what would we say? Like, what is the controlling idea of Dead Space? And it's will you suffer the truth?
Yeah, right.
Or another way to put it is like the controlling idea is, can the protagonist suffer the truth and face reality to become his ultimate self?
Right.
And I think...
Right. No, I just think it's powerful for several reasons, right? It's very intimate, and it's a flawed protagonist in a really good way. Like right off the bat, Isaac is like a little too codependent on his girlfriends. Like he has some emotional baggage. He doesn't process well. As a matter of fact, can't handle the fact that his girlfriend is dead and is in denial. So he's not quite like, Fight Club yet. He's not quite, that guy, but he's like not quite healthy. Yeah. And so he can't suffer the truth. And if that becomes like the pain of truth, hard truths, death, lost relationships, the pain of loss, if that's the theme of what's running it, that's very solid. Yeah. That'll give you a protagonist who can drive a series, right? And there's even the hope of conjugating that from episode to episode where it's a new chapter, which is what we're going to talk about. Because sometimes you have a thing out there for protagonists to do, and they do, and then the franchise is over. You know what I mean? You don't want that. Like, I got the ring into Mordor, now what? You're like, it's over.
Yeah, exactly. Which I think is why Dead Space 1 did such a good job, is the fact that, like, this whole idea of, like, can you suffer the truth? And Dead Space 1, the sublog line of that is, like, will Isaac even see the truth?
Right.
And so the whole plot or the whole twist of Dead Space 1, obviously, spoilers, is that, like, Nicole's already dead, and Isaac probably knew that before the game even begins.
Right. He might have known it somewhere before the frame starts. Yeah. He's like, she's dead, and he just can't handle it. He's going to see.
Like the opening frame is him watching the video.
Right. That's right.
Where we know she dies at the end of it, but again, like, he is so emotionally mature and repressed, like he can't see the truth.
Right.
And so that is the whole through line of Dead Space 1. And when we're looking at it again from a franchise perspective and like a hero's journey perspective, that is just the very beginning. At the end of Dead Space 1, he watches that video and he realizes, oh, Nicole's dead, through his own hubris, through his own like copium, just like trying to delude himself to think she's not dead. He finally sees the truth at the end of Dead Space 1. And that is it. That's like, again, if we're looking from a hero's journey perspective, he's just opened the door.
It is literally just the very beginning.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's important that you mention that because, like, it's a whole... Like, that's Dead Space 1 is really just introductions.
Exactly.
It's almost like it's an establishing shot almost of the franchise, even though there's a lot going on and there's all this stuff. And in the Motive remake, they kept all this. Like, he did, like you just said, from the opening frame, which I kind of love that it ties back.
Yeah.
He watches a video that he's clearly not seeing the entirety of, and at the very end, it ties out that he does.
Yeah.
And so he steps into a better version of himself. A protagonist has a crossover, their old world, old self, new world, new self. His new world, new self is his truth. He holds the truth. He sees it. He's, oh my God, she's dead. So he deals with it. And Motive did such a good job of providing some beautiful flesh to the backstory. Like, he and Nicole got into a fight.
Yeah, which is awesome.
Remember that?
Yeah.
Oh, that's so good. And
the new side quests that they've added.
Right? And you hear that she had been responsible, or at least an agent of his mother's death. Not on purpose, but she was part of that the machinery there. And they had a fight about it, and he said some bad things, that he didn't mean to in the heat of the moment. So there's a hugely beautifully worked out relationship there, which, explains some of his what his baggage is about. But he crosses over and encounters the markers. Yeah. So this is where you've got somebody on one path heading towards, my girlfriend is in trouble. Mm-hmm. She's dead, and I can't admit it. When he crosses the line of destiny, and destiny meets him he touches markers, and this becomes now Isaac's destiny. So even though we're talking about Isaac facing the truth, and that generates all 4 movies, all 4 Dead Spaces, the underlying antagonist of the entire franchise is the markers which he meets. Right? And so you get to the end of Dead Space 1, and let's say that's beginnings.
Yeah.
Right.
Basically, like, this is all just introducing the entire plot of the entire series that we're talking about.
Yeah, the threads and the actors and the components.
And it's also, again, I think what Motive did a great job with, especially with the side quests, is you see, because when you're playing the game and you can only put in as many, you try and put as many character moments in there as you can, but when there's a guy shooting zombies and stuff, he's still got to be the hero, right? And Isaac is still a hero, even though he's extremely flawed. But they put in those moments of, even when he's like fighting with Nicole in that side quest, you can see him, like, his emotional immaturity of rejecting her. He lashes out at her. She turns off the video, right? And again, you can see that's his entire through line of that is, again, like, he watches the video at the beginning. He just, like, cannot accept the truth.
Right.
And so a lot of that, again, his emotional arc, regardless of the plot of the Necromorphs, which is important, but we're talking more about like his emotional core. What is the series trying to say about Isaac? What is his arc? What are his wants and needs throughout the entire series? Dead Space 1 is just him being like, hey, can you even like look at the thing that you need to look at? Like, can you even comprehend this? Which he does, and that's like a complete arc at the end of Dead Space 1 is he just opens the door and says, oh, there's fucked up shit happening, right? Like, I'm a flawed person. I was repressing my emotions this whole time.
Mm-hmm. And I think that sets him up to then generate 2, 3, and 4. Like
exactly.
That is the character who will then you start to take those tendencies as a character and move those into the escalating conflict with the entire franchise villain. Mm-hmm. So maybe as a shortcut to this too, we can talk about, well, what does that look like to plan out 2, 3, and 4 from Dead Space 1? Mm-hmm. Given if this is introduction, emotionally flawed character, difficulty facing, painful truths, right, and an antagonist all too willing to take advantage of that to get its end, and it's a supernatural thing. But here's an antagonist that particular weakness is very bad for.
Exactly, and half of what the markers do is deluding people and controlling their minds, right? Right. So it's very much a through line and it's tied through again Isaac's arc. It's just like the markers tie into that. They're like the perfect weapon against him, which is like, oh, here's a guy who can't, he's so emotionally mature, he will delude himself.
He's halfway there. I don't need to have much of an insanity film for this guy.
Yeah,
he's like a pushover.
Yeah.
So he's easy to control for the markers. We also set up Isaac as then this really smart dude who, in the ecology of the markers, which took us a while to figure out, they go to these, they're not Kardashev 1 societies, but they're probably pretty advanced societies, maybe post faster than light travel societies, where they infect this highly technological society, and a certain layer of that society understands the signal the marker puts out as a replicatory thing. It's like, okay, you're going to make more markers and keep this going. The rest of you are fodder, and you're going to become the Brethren Moon later, and that's how that works. And he's a replicator. He's meant to be this guy. So he meets his destiny there. He's both vulnerable and super smart, and now he's kind of not okay. He's screwed. Here we go. Dead Space 2.
Yeah, as we say, like basically Dead Space 1 is, we wouldn't, again in the world where we're planning this like franchise board, it's like Dead Space 1 is great. Like we don't need to do anything there. Motive did a great job. Like it's
start awesome with the remake. That's just perfect. Yeah, nothing to change there.
And then I think then Dead Space 2, like again, if Dead Space 1 is will you see the truth, and then again we answer that question at the very very end. We say yes, Isaac will see the truth. Cool, credits.
Is capable of seeing the truth.
It's
still
just
flawed.
Capable.
He just got it. He just figured it out.
He's just opened the door. Now in Dead Space 2, this is again where we've talked about how it's the aliens to the alien, right? It's just like now we kick shit off. If you're looking at it from a hero's journey standpoint, he's crossed the threshold. Now it's fun and games, which is actually just shit goes crazy.
It could be that's almost all of Dead Space 2.
Exactly. And so this is then we're talking about will you see the truth? Now it's can you live with the truth? Right now he can now understand that Nicole's dead. Like, can you live with this fact that your girlfriend has died after all of your emotional trauma? Which again is where we can talk about where we can talk about the ghost of Nicole, right? Because it's like all of a sudden Nicole's ghost shows up. It's like, hey, apparently you can't live with that truth because Nicole showed up here, right? And we'll have to talk about the ghost because I know that's kind of a big thing in terms of lore.
We'll call the ghost problem an execution problem. I think this is the nuts and bolts of the layout. Like you said, the first dramatic question of Dead Space 1 is can you live with the truth? At the very end, not can you live with, can you face the truth?
Can you face the truth?
And then he finally does. Yeah. Now, having faced the truth, what next? How does that truth work with you? Can you live with it? Are you processing? Well, you're just starting the stages of grief. Here, it's like, not so much.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, it's actually a problem. Like, he keeps seeing the ghost. The ghost is quite confusing, maybe even trying to do him harm. Like, it's really, things get worse for having let himself see the truth.
Exactly, because again, this is where the markers as the antagonist will escalate the stakes. And, they're all up in his brain, making him see shit.
Right.
And obviously he's seeing Nicole's ghost as well.
Right. And I think that's where you would calibrate the ghost execution to this need. Like, what is Isaac doing here about coping with... Mm-hmm. You've agreed to at least comprehend that she died.
Right.
Now what do? Well, you might act out. You might become all kinds of crazy. You might do all these crazy things. And so arguably the marker fight at the end would be Isaac finally resolving this next phase of grief, which is not acceptance necessarily, but more like at least an answer, good or bad, to the dramatic question. Now, can you live with the truth?
Yeah.
And that's what his struggle would be. And I think, like you said, the fun in games is all the complication of it. By the way, your brain is so smart, there was a marker. Blueprint in it, and they got it out and built a whole new one. You're responsible for the end of humanity. Oh my God. So he has to answer the call again. Even more, save humanity, which he does, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And we talked about this. He sort of agrees to make the ultimate sacrifice at the end. Like, he does all of what it takes to defeat whatever the big monster is, and sits outside the marker. Roll credits. Like, there's a roll credits happening, and he's going to die.
Right.
He's like, I'm ready to die. Ellie pops in, saves him, and off they go to Dead Space 3. I would... Basically, again, with the answer, I would just keep all of Dead Space 2 as is.
Right. Maybe
Figure out this Nicole ghost. I think the one question.
I think, as we, were talking about this, I think, again, from a trying to find the through line through the whole franchise, and I think, you've talked about this in the past, the boss fight at the end of Dead Space 2 is where it kind of goes off the rails a little bit. And the reason is because... based on, again, like this whole arc of Isaac trying to live with the truth, and in terms of lore, we set up like potentially the ghosts are like kind of a white blood cell response of humanity, and Isaac being able to kind of repress the marker. So Nicole was always helpful through the entirety of the game, and I believe that the original design was that Nicole was just going to be like, "Great job, Isaac."
Well. Yeah, if you play through Dead Space 2 until the boss fight at the end, where you think that's going is where it was going.
Right.
She was helpful. She put you into the eye poke machine. She says, "You be ready, here we go."
Yeah.
Like, she's guiding you to what was supposed to be just the final fight with the marker entity. Mm-hmm. And like we were telling you guys, we focus tested it. There wasn't a boss fight that didn't pass well. We had to put a boss fight in at the last minute.
Right.
Someone made it Nicole, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense given what we did with. But what I would say it would be, like you put the dramatic question there, is like, what is Isaac's final crisis question internally at that moment?
Which
is
can you letting go of Nicole?
Can you let go of Nicole?
Right, exactly.
Right.
So it's like, can you live with this truth? And the truth is Nicole is dead. And so that again, we set up that at the very beginning. Can you live with the truth?
Can you see the truth?
Yeah.
Now, can you live with the truth or accept with?
Yeah,
maybe?
Exactly. And then at the end of that, it's obviously the dramatic question to the protagonist is you need to let go of Nicole, which is again kind of what was trying to be set up at the end of Dead Space 2, or what we would set up at Dead Space 2.
Right.
I think that obviously at the time it was like, well, it wasn't as good of a climactic end because it's like you need a boss fight at the end of the video game, and it turns out that players don't like it if you just say like game's over.
Oops, what did you do? You shot a thing.
And so this is obviously where a game can diverge a bit from a movie, because at the movie it's like you're serving the story 1000%, and that's all that your job is necessarily, is to put the story as best you can in frame. The game also has to be fun, and there's player expectations, and there's design expectations, and you need to have a fun climax at the end of the game. And so a very kind of tied up, will Isaac let go of Nicole at the end of it just wasn't working.
But what you might do if you were gonna, and I wouldn't recommend redoing all of Dead Space 2 just to fix this ending,
right?
But
I think it does set up into, because this is where we can talk about kind of this ball is a little bit where, again, where if we were looking at it from a franchise standpoint, it goes off the rails a little bit, where it just gets confused, where all of a sudden it's like, okay, wait, we're not answering this dramatic question that we've posed anymore.
Right.
And so I think the only change that would, again, make sense heading into Dead Space 3 is making Dead Space 2 more of a tragedy. Right, so it's basically, can you let go of Nicole? And you could still have that climactic boss fight, whether it's versus Nicole or not, I'm not sure. But basically the question would be asked is, can you let go of Nicole? And the thing that we talked about was, which again would tie into Dead Space 3, which we'll talk about, is Isaac fractures himself, right? Because he's such an emotionally kind of immature person. Half of him wants to be the hero and let go of Nicole, but the other half of him is like, I'm scared. There's necromorphs, I miss you, right? And so we've talked about basically at the end of Dead Space 2, he like almost fractures his personality, right? And he even further goes down this rabbit hole of, mental instability.
Oh, right. So that's a good plan. For his attempt to reconcile with reality, the dramatic question is, can you live with this truth?
Yeah.
The answer is, I will try and no.
And he fails, right?
And fail and split.
So he defeats the marker, but it's again going back to his old ways. And so, however this would play out, basically the climax would be this almost mental shattering between almost two Isaacs. One who's the hero who's trying to let go of Nicole and move forward and has the power to defeat the markers.
Right.
But the other who's still so ingrained he can't get past his old ways.
Right. He actually can't move past it, even though he tries, which breaks him.
Yeah.
That's a super important beat that should be at the end of 2. And I would even argue for the Nicole fight at the end, it can be a bit like an anglerfish. Like whatever is happy and positive there, the marker gets wise to it and decides to put the biggest challenge in front of Isaac, which is like, can you kill Nicole?
Yeah.
And it's not her anymore, it's some sleight of hand. So you still end up fighting her as a boss, but what it was the marker, one last defense.
Yeah.
A thing it thought you couldn't cross, you cross it and kill her, which breaks you.
Right.
And instead of the scene, I think the best change we could make is that shuttle scene at the end of 2, instead of Isaac turning to Ellie and we playing it for a gag, she's like, what? You think it's going to be a ghost jump? I would instead have the exact same scene from Dead Space 1, but in Dead Space 2's ending, where he turns and looks and we see Isaac.
We see another
What's
Isaac.
going to be Dark Isaac in Dead Space 3.
Right.
So basically everything you said, like, that's it. And I think that's the perfect way to structure all this is around those really central core things, like what is a dramatic question? Can you, this is like, are you going to be able to live with the truth? He attempts it through all of the trials and gets to success, but breaks him. Now we're into Dead Space 3.
Exactly. And the reason that we would do, obviously we talked a lot about in our playthrough, therefore buts, where it's basically being like, you have to give both the protagonist and a player a win, but then you don't want just credits roll, game over, never, you need to have another escalation, raising the stakes or something that is related to that. So again, this from a narrative standpoint, we don't want the franchise to end here. We don't want to be like, Isaac fixed himself, he's good now, he stopped the markers and he's fixed his mental problems and he's great. We need to give the player a win, which is obviously will defeat the markers, and Isaac needs to have some kind of growth as a person, but through that growth, he does kind of make it, but also he's compartmentalized. It's almost like, Moon Knight or something like that.
Oh, right.
We've talked a lot about Fight Club, Dead Space 3 basically being, Fight Club, more or less, right? Like, he fractures himself, but you don't really know that. It's teased at the end of Dead Space 2, which is, again, what you were saying, where he turns and sees another Isaac. What? Cut to credits. Cliffhanger. Right.
I think that constructs everything you're saying quite perfectly, because the big win is defeating the marker that he created and not letting it create a convergence event. He tries the thing to live with it. It saw it, tries to live with it, for the sake of, maybe it would even make that be the requirement to get into Act 3, is that he does live with it a bit, and then where he breaks afterwards can even be the denouement into 3, whatever. But I think all that's perfectly correct. You have to have a big win, a small therefore but, you kick out. So then I guess now we're on to Dead Space 3.
Exactly. So this is again like
about Dead Space 3.
Yeah, so we were talking about how Dead Space 1 keep the same, Dead Space 2 basically keep it exactly the same, just a small tweak at the end.
How would you possibly I don't think it's worth it to redo all of Dead Space 2. Maybe you just do a republish, like play Dead Space 3, which revisits the ending from the very last boss fight, and there's an extra.
Yeah, meep.
I would even do that as like a last time on you're like redoing Dead Space 3.
Yeah.
And last time on Dead Space, and you're like you're watching play through this, you're like, that's not how that ends. Oh, I guess this is this is the re-canon diversion of stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know. That's a problem for another day, but it's like
the elephant in the room is that Dead Space 3 was not, as successful as Dead Space 1 and 2 for a variety of reasons.
Many reasons.
Right. And so, and a lot of that, again, like this is not like this is just the way that it works when you're trying to make a franchise and a game that is viable.
Yeah. Millions of dollars are being bet.
Yeah.
It's not like you can fold your arms and be cross as an artist about, no, it's got to be this. It's like, well, that's not quite how that works. Like, you've got to be, there's a return on investment number that has to be hit.
Yeah.
And so there were some calculated risks that we all made that we thought would do it, and it didn't work out. Because
even though Dead Space 1 and 2 were critically acclaimed games, very expensive to make, single player horror is just a small genre. It doesn't have a big player base, and not a lot of people. They'd rather play a multiplayer game or a competitive game rather than a single player narrative horror experience.
I mean, that's almost inarguable at this point, because the cap seems to be around 2 million people who are really wanting
right
to see it.
Which sounds like a lot, but it's when you're talking dev cost, years of hundreds of people.
No, that's nothing. I mean, it's literally nothing.
Yeah.
That's why Frank Jabot said it needed to be 5 million. I mean, that's the honest look at the numbers.
Yeah.
And Skyrim does like 10 million, and Calls of Duty do like 17, 18, 19, 27 now. Battlefields do 17 to 20 something, and Calls of Duty do 24 million units, right? And that's for packaged goods. So it's just a not very fertile field for revenue, so you have to keep your costs way down. Yeah. And so they did need us to move on, and so the plan was that we would expand into other gameplay genres and stuff, and I think all those bets together not only didn't generate new audience, they lost old audience. Yeah. The gun mechanic, the recrafting missed a lot of the stuff that everybody loved about the old one, and it created a whole bunch of exploration space. We were on a big wide open planet because of that, and all these decisions had lots of follow on. And then co-op, just this hits keep coming. I was like, what, co-op?
Yeah.
And then on top of that, we weren't allowed to make a horror game from the beginning. So Ben and I were like, well, what are we making? It was just, if you look at it, man, it's a beautiful Drake's Uncharted game. It's an adventure with puzzles and set pieces. And you've got this shaved-headed Marine character that we put in, which thank God Ricardo Chavara was there. That guy really acted, it so warmly that it was a great character in the end, but it wasn't the idea that we had. So
all that to say, there was fiscal and design reasons why Dead Space 3 was designed the way that it was, right? It was because it was look, in order to keep Visceral around and in order to keep Dead Space around, it needs to be financially viable. We can't just throw money away. So it was we need to put in more action elements because, again, if we're going to try to compete with Call of Duty or Gears of War at the time.
Oh my God, we even put in Gears of War in there. You were shooting at people and they were shooting at you, and there was a cover mechanic.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, we were so off-brand at that point between the co-op and the cover. It was we were not even close to Dead Space.
Right, exactly. And like you were saying, it was just okay, well, if we're going to keep Dead Space alive, this is what we have to try to be competitive with the current market. But then, like you were saying, as development went on and the horror became such a smaller and smaller element, and then when the first playtesters started playing, they're like,
a lovely game you've got here. Where's the Dead Space?
Right, exactly.
There was no Dead Space in the Dead Space.
And so then horror was tried to put back in, but at
the
that
very
point,
end, it was too late. That's where the Nutcrackers come in at the end and the cool co-op moment.
So it is just kind of the tough development, which obviously happens in games all the time when you're trying to figure out how to make something financially viable and design problems and all of that, and also trying to figure out the narrative while the design is changing underneath your feet.
One of the biggest narrative challenges I've ever faced is we didn't have co-op as a feature until a year into Dead Space 3.
Wow.
So we had not written the story to do that. Yeah. By the time they figured out that co-op had to get in, there was just enough time to get the feature in on an engineering schedule. So we, a narrative, were
we have to write another main character
so that this isn't so that this isn't a page one rewrite, and even though it kind of was, obviously, the other character is going to be around all the time, run by AI. Yeah. So that you have the same characters in the scenes all the time, either being driven by a player or driven by AI, because obviously you can't have scenes. An entire version of the game where there's not the second character and there's a second character. How could you write for that? And they're like, no, that's exactly what you're going to do.
We're okay.
We were like, that doesn't make sense. And everyone's like, don't know, don't care. Yeah. And Ben and I were like, oh my fucking God, how are we going to solve this? So we had to go back in basically and surgically every cinematic in the game had to have an in and an out variant that was either Carver is here or he's not. And you had to write it so that he had either left Isaac and run along with the narrative troupe that was going to meet you at point B and then walks into the room literally, hi Isaac, or is already there. Right. And you had to delicately massage all the conversation that didn't stare at the obvious problem, was he there, was he not there? Right. And so that was, I thought it's not possible to do it. And then we just started looking at it and found some ways. I never want to do that again. So ridiculous.
It's hard,
dude. It was we finally got some conditional code that would let him pop in and out of the scenes. But to say all of that, let's just do a general look back at Dead Space 3 and adjudicate exactly what should we do with Dead Space 3.
Exactly. And I mean, as we were analyzing it, we were talking about you could actually keep most of it. You can keep the lore, you can keep the Brethren Moons, you can keep, the relationship with Ellie. There's like, from a lore standpoint and from like a kind of high level beat standpoint, you can keep Tal Volantis, you can keep all of this stuff. But again, because of all of the design changes and what was needed from Dead Space 3 in order to make it work as a game, whenever there's so many competitors, it just obviously was just like, we just, you guys did the best you could.
No, I wouldn't. I'm not revisiting the decision or trying to relitigate the decision. I think, though, now in this remake territory, I would redo Dead Space 3 almost completely, except for what you said. I would keep the lore beat that it's predicated on, keep the lore you find out. I would have an Ellie there, but a different relationship, and I would
bring it back to Isaac, right?
Yeah, I would do the entire main story. I would just throw away and rewrite.
Yeah,
with what we've talked about.
Because of when you're adding a whole main character, late in development, and you got to redo all of these different beats, it's hard to again keep this through line of, okay, the story's still about Isaac, right? It's about two people now, like
and doing what? Like, is he just being a hero? Yeah. Like, he has a pretty pithy. He's trying to work through these relationships and a love triangle. Like, I wouldn't even look at all that. I would just start from complete scratch, and I would make this, like we talked about at the end of Dead Space 2, he's broken.
Yeah.
And now this is the adventure of Isaac in Dead Space 3, broken Isaac.
Exactly.
Because he tried to do the thing, tried to do the truth, it broke him. Now we're in the consequences of him being broken, and it's now I would just make it like I would make it like a Tyler Durden thing.
Exactly.
And an unreliable narrator, and you're like, what happened? And the player maybe doesn't even know. Isaac certainly doesn't know. And is it him? Is it really him? And maybe it is. Like, who knows and this is many ways to write this. Yeah. But I would keep that question alive for most of 3 until you realize at the end, it maybe actually is something real. Like, maybe the necromorphs are actually creating another entity of him that is manifesting from his broken psyche, and he's getting some, it's not just imagination.
Yeah, because again, we from a franchise perspective and from a controlling idea perspective, you always have to bring it back to this controlling idea, which is like, can he face the truth and can he suffer, reality to become his ultimate self? This is why the rewrite would potentially need to happen, is because again, we need to focus it back on Isaac. We need to bring it back to what the entire franchise is trying to say.
Yeah, and what's the dramatic question here?
Yeah, and so then Dead Space 3 would be, we talked about Dead Space 1 being, will you see the truth? And then in Dead Space 2, can you live with the truth? And at the end, we basically say, no.
Good try, no. And you're broken.
So now, because, like you said, he's been fractured, now we basically have a Tyler Durden Isaac, which again, you could keep a lot of this stuff. You could, like you said, you could keep the lore, you could keep co-op.
If you wanted to keep co-op, should you be so brave? Yeah. Not necessary. I mean, I think that should be on the table as well.
Potentially.
Even to bother with that. Just keep the engine you've got.
Yeah.
Because co-op is, as you know, Brian, is like trying to manage latency. Now suddenly you've got server issues, co-op. Like, it explodes the budget. If you don't do it, you don't have to. You don't need that at all.
So now we start Dead Space 3 where, we would recast, Carver in a different way, or we would recast, what's his face, Norton in another way. But again, the story should be focusing on Isaac and his struggle, where we kick up Dead Space 1, where he's mentally fractured. And so the whole fun gameplay that, a lot of people really liked in Dead Space 3 was not really knowing what's real, right? Like, your co-op partner would see some necromorphs that you wouldn't see, and vice versa. Right. You could really push into that mechanic gameplay-wise, which would also, again, lean into the story of what is real here, like what is happening, right? You could have moments where, again, we're almost making, again, two characters with Isaac and then Shadow Isaac that are kind of Tyler Durdening back and forth. So you could have moments where you don't know what's real, like, are the necromorphs all of a sudden they're on your side for some reason, or what is real here? So you can really lean into that, like, mental instability, the markers infecting Isaac's mind, because now they can keep even more in there. There's like two Isaacs that are fractured in his mind. So there's a lot of really fun gameplay moments you could have that still lean into this arc of Isaac being mentally fractured and him trying to figure out, like, who am I at this point? Like, what is real?
Well, that would be what I would even build those two characters, like you had said at the beginning. It breaks into, I can handle it and I couldn't handle it.
Right.
And I'm in denial and I'm doing all these things, which is also the markers, like trying to get this guy going. And here's real you trying to finally process the grief and get going, and they're just fighting kind of like Gollum-y in a way. And I think that becomes a dramatic question writ large in the frame is, will Isaac resolve this break?
Right.
Now that the truth broke you, can you heal?
Yeah.
To face the truth. So it's still kind of the same theme. Can you face the truth?
Yeah, which also kind of leads into make us whole, which is kind of fun.
Can Isaac make himself whole? Which would be a really great thing. And then if Nicole is still around, like, what's he doing with her in his mind? Is she still there? Not really. How is he handling that?
Yeah.
Ellie can be this great... The love triangle should be Nicole, Ellie, and Isaac.
Yeah.
And not Norton, Ellie, Isaac. Right. And I think, Robert Grant, I love that guy too. Like, we had such a great cast. I would want all those people still in.
Yeah.
And even those characters, but I would just rewrite the main story and find whole new purposes for them.
To better serve Isaac and what we're trying to say.
Yes, as the support cast that's reflecting some aspect of Isaac's struggle in a way that's there. Because those guys want to be in Dead Space 3 for sure. And I think that would just be it. I don't even know what the pitch would be, that the conflict of like what you have to rewrite a whole main story and break a whole new story for these two Gollum Isaacs, right, or these two Tyler Durden people, but figure out that story, and that would be, I think, what you would write Dead Space 3 to be, and keep the lore piece you want to keep, in my opinion, is all the stuff like the fact that we find out it's the answer to the Fermi paradox, like, why is there no life in the universe? Well, it was all eaten by necromorph moons, and Tau Volantis kept Earth from being eaten because they heroically sacrificed their whole planet to freeze the Brethren moons, which let us unknowingly be the Shire forever and ever, and we just turned it off.
Right.
And now here they come. So you've, as always with Dead Space, you do the wrong thing.
Right, exactly. Which you could even make even more literal when you're forced to play as Shadow Isaac at that point, right? It's like, then you can really have fun. Because, Dead Space has always had these moments which we, when we've been talking about, like, how you, from a plot standpoint, how you align what Isaac is trying to do and what he should do as the hero, but also what the necromorphs are trying to do, of like messing with his mind, because there is a psychological horror element to Dead Space. So it's Dead Space 1 and 2, it was kind of hard to know, like, what is Isaac trying to do as himself, but what is he being controlled to do? Is he actually the good guy? But Dead Space 3, because you almost have two Isaacs, you can really lean super hard into like, no, you're playing as Shadow Isaac, no, and whether you know it or not, you're doing really fucked up stuff.
Yeah, you can actually, I would totally do that, and I would make it where the turn it off was a phrase in Dead Space 3 in reference to turn off the machine, let the Brethren moons thaw and go after it again. That'll be Dark Isaac's entire purpose against the other Isaac. So he's still essentially now in frame fighting again. This is going to lead into Dead Space 4. The markers. He's always fighting the markers, and they're trying to control him because they need him to do things, right? They need his brain, all this stuff. So he's still got some sense of agency and presence, and he's like, they're trying to confuse him, doing a great job of that, and trying to get him to turn the thing off. Maybe he even does that at the end, unknowingly, like Dark Isaac tricks Good Isaac into doing it.
Yeah.
To be part of the broken story. But yeah, I think all that's perfect. It's in frame, it's a struggle. He gets there, throw in whatever you're doing with Ellie and Nicole, and then the third Isaac, like that whole four-way of people is the main cast, and they figure something out.
Yeah.
Do you want to leap into Dead Space 4 now?
Well, the one thing I did want to say was, and this I think works also, again, if you're trying to, because when you're looking at like, the structure of a film, or you can overlay it on the structure of a franchise too. Now we've kind of crossed over into the midpoint. Now we're really escalating the stakes. Stuff is really starting to go off the fucking rails. We're not only from a plot standpoint are we realizing Earth is at risk, but also like Isaac's mental health is at risk. He's completely like he's even though he's making progression as a character, you need things to still somehow get worse. And so now like he's literally fighting himself. It's literally in frame with two people. And so again, like from a structure standpoint, that's why we've decided to have two Isaacs, and why things are just getting worse and worse and worse and worse until the end of Dead Space 3, which again, from like a hero's journey perspective, is the dark night of the soul. Like things have to get terrible, and so not only do we realize that Isaac himself has directly put Earth in the line of fire, but we've talked about at the end of, you could potentially keep the climax of where he's fighting the Brethren Moon or whatever, and maybe it crashes down on him. But at the end of Dead Space 3, again, a kind of a cliffhanger-y moment, maybe, because you had this in the DLC as well. Isaac, it crashes on him and he wakes up.
Well, inexplicably and miraculously, he and Carver both wake up.
Exactly.
After having a moon crashed on them.
Right,
and then make their way back to Earth where the moons are.
Right, and so at the end of Dead Space 3, Isaac would wake up and be like, how am I still alive? But, whatever, can only think of a cheesy version. You look and his eyes are red or whatever, right? It's like, oh, Shadow Isaac won. Shadow Isaac remains at the end of Dead Space 3.
Right. I think that would be the smartest play. I was going to say, no, I think that's the right answer. So yeah, I think you have the same ending where you essentially defeat what you think is defeat the moons in order to stop the machine from being turned on. And I would suck the DLC into that as well, so we don't need the DLC after this, right? And then, what it seems like Isaac's I would even say it seems like he defeats Dark Isaac in order to be able to make the sacrifice to end the moons from going forward, which happens, and he seems to have a big sacrifice moment. That something resolve Nicole and Ellie for this beat. Give me a hook for the next section, and then, like you said, after the moon crashes, he rises in somehow from it, and it is Dark Isaac,
right? Or
it looks like it. Maybe it was Isaac, and you get around to some other clue. You're like, that's not good Isaac. Maybe it's Dark Isaac.
Exactly.
That then is the hook into Dead Space 4, right? So that's the denouement almost, or even maybe a credit scene where you think Isaac did it. He stopped him from coming.
Yeah.
Oh wait, no, he's still around.
Exactly. And so then that is, again, we love to end Dead Space on little cliffhangers, like some kind of tease of like, oh wait, it's kind of like I don't know, at the end of Inception or at the end of, I think, Annihilation does this, where you see something in their eye, like, wait a second, is that not him? Right? The little tease to be like, oh wait, maybe he didn't defeat Shadow Isaac, and maybe he's still, obviously, because there's a fourth game, we can't have him resolve all of his trauma. And so then would be where Dead Space 4 kicks off. Dead Space 1 is Alien. Dead Space 2 is Aliens. Dead Space 3 is Fight Club. Dead Space 4 is Matrix.
Yes, where you transcend the entire thing. Yeah. And I would even argue now, Isaac struggled with broken Isaac, which the marker was taking advantage of almost supernaturally to make this broken psyche manifest, maybe physically. And as a matter of fact, that hint dropped through Dead Space 3 is what you learn at the beginning of Dead Space 4, is what happened. Yeah. Like, it killed off Flesh Isaac, and now you just have essentially Dark Necromorph Isaac, right? And but he's still in there as what's going to happen is the next thing. Like, you might be able to kill off Good Isaac and have Dark Isaac, but Good Isaac is actually still available in some way. And now the dramatic question is, can you thwart? Well, I was saying, can you thwart destiny? There's a sub theme there where Isaac faces, like, he's destined through his DNA and fate to have intersected with this thing, to come to this moment and be the herald of death to Earth. And can he overcome who he's meant to be? Which is a little bit like, I'm meant to be this weird relationship broken person who can't see the truth. Right. Can you overcome that? That question escalates and escalates and escalates to 4, where I'm not sure how we would set this up, but the essence of the plot is you go. What I would say is, you find out at the end of Space 4 is that he is the herald of the markers, which is they need him to get back to Earth, find Earth through his DNA, some fun space magic that he's needed to go back and finally finish conquering this arm of the galaxy and eat Earth and all of its colonies. And he does that for some period of time, like without even knowing what's going on, probably going to hope, he's like, I'm going to go find Ellie or Nicole back on Earth, heads back. And then we start to see things aren't quite what we think. Like, this is a Dark Isaac and not quite. And there's actual Good Isaac and they're trying to get out, which it becomes the new conflict. Can he become Neo of the Matrix inside it with the Necromorph and take control of the hive mind? Right,
exactly. Because he has basically, at the end of Dead Space 3, him and Shadow Isaac have become one. It's almost as if now he is one with the markers, and because we've talked about it, he's Rex. Basically, Dead Space 4 starts and he's a necromorph. Like, he's been resurrected.
It'd be fun to start that far back, and you may or may not know that was the combined one of them, and you're like, oh, is that what happened to Isaac? And then as you learn, he's struggling to reemerge. Like, it seems like he was defeated, but hope springs eternal. Like, Isaac is like still there.
Yeah, exactly. So that's where we joked about in Dead Space 4. Maybe it opens up and you're like cuddling on the couch with Nicole in your apartment, everything's great, and then like we joked about the pyro in TF2 where you get flashes of like everything's on fire and then you feel like perfect life and you're like, oh, everything's great, and then like you see what's actually happening. And so Isaac is almost, he's still in there and he's seeing what this perfect life is, but in reality he's bringing he's literally bringing necromorphs to Earth. They're playing baseball with each other, whatever. And
the only way for him to come out of the state is to acknowledge the painful truth.
Exactly.
And he's busy living in some fantasy world like the Matrix, that that's how they've kept his spirit. They killed his body, but his still inside the Dark Isaac. Like, he's part of the necromorphs now. Like, in a sort of,
which we talked about Ellie, as kind of his, I don't know if it's a foil, but like she helps him, see that through that romantic.
Well, I think
arc.
that would be great if he gets in a sort of Casablanca way, transcends romantic arc. Will always have the love we had and either one or both of his girlfriends sort of helps him move along, and he's finally not trying to just get back with them or deny that they're dead. He's like finally having a much more advanced version of love, which helps him sort of move along. I think that'd be a better theme. And what I like about the Dead Space 4 we're talking about is it's got a good premise.
Yeah.
And a good understanding of who he is and what his journey kind of is to, to fight, to defeat the hive mind itself through all many personal journeys. But there's a lot of different fun pieces for the plot to put in. Like, when did they get back to Earth? Is that the opening? Is that the inciting incident? I don't know. It's like lots of fun ways to get from Tau Volantis to Earth. And then once you get to Earth, what are you doing? What's happening? Where do you structure the acts? Is it in Isaac's understanding of what's going on, or he gets that early and then fights along the way? I can see a lot of really fun different ways for that to structure out.
But the important part is, again, like from the arc standpoint, is like we start Dead Space, between Dead Space 3 and 4 is basically the all is lost moment, and like Isaac is fucked. He's become Shadow Isaac. He's become literally a necromorph. He's resurrected. He's bringing the markers to Earth, and so now this is the ultimate climax of the series. Is he has to literally transcend himself, and then we joked about also, like, because he's literally a necromorph, kind of like in the Matrix, he's in the system now, he can see the code. You could have a really fun climax at the end of the game, or maybe he's like literally controlling waves of necromorphs because he's he can control them now, and he's doing all kinds of crazy shit. Who knows how high sci-fi you want to go, or how crazy, but you could, right? What a fun way to have the series end where he's he accepts that he's a necromorph, but he's still going to save the day. Right?
Let's talk about like what the ending would be. Like, on brand for Dead Space would be a darkly bittersweet ending, where he probably does finally accept his own death now, the ultimate accept the truth. He's kind of done it once or twice before, but this one's the real deal, and he's like, I'm going to go, and he finally does. We would go ahead and kill Isaac here. Would he save humanity?
Yeah, because this is the fun why we don't relate to so much to the Matrix, is because, again, when you're looking at Isaac's arc across all of these games, it's him not being able to cope with the emotional trauma of losing someone he cares so deeply about, which is Nicole. And so because of the idea that he would be a necromorph essentially throughout the game, the climax of not only Dead Space 4 but of the entire series would be potentially he's interfacing with the hive mind in some kind of dream state or whatever, and they literally say, hey, we resurrected you, we can resurrect Nicole too. We can give you utopia, we'll give you your own planet, you can just go live with Nicole. Who knows if they're just in some kind of weird dream state, and some necromorph
the promise of what he's always wanted is available to him because of these space magic. And
exactly. So because Isaac has become so powerful, and he's in the hive mind itself, and it's kind of scared of him now. It's like they're like, stop, look, we'll give you what you want, we'll give you Nicole, we'll give you the perfect life, like, just we'll leave you alone, just let us.
It's nice. It's like a blue pill. It's like, you want a blue pill?
100%. It's a blue pill or red pill. Or do you want to keep fighting us and you will die, and millions will die, but maybe you'll save Earth, but like.
But over here, the red pill is maybe save Earth.
Yeah.
And the blue pill is keep eating societies forever and just keep going as a necromorph.
But we'll give you utopia.
You get utopia in your brain.
Yeah.
That's a perfect, like, always, in my opinion, you always start writing from the end, and you figure out the end once you have enough pieces on the table.
Yeah.
That's a really, really perfect ending, and then you would work backwards from that.
Right.
So that would then, in other words, you would never get confused along the way about what to do with Nicole.
Right.
She's always headed at that spot, so you could then get as wildly misdirected as you wanted because you knew where it had to finally unravel to. So I think that would be the perfect ending there. Well, that would be the perfect climax.
And because it is a direct question to the controlling idea of the entire series, which is, can he face reality and suffer the truth to become his ultimate self? And
right.
He has to accept at that moment, like, I am dead as a necromorph. She is dead.
Right.
She is gone.
Our relationship is gone.
Our relationship is over.
This life is over.
So he will have to take, the red pill. That's where he will reject the hive mind's bargain, and then climax, crazy shit happens. He saves the day.
Yeah, exactly. And
Ellie shows up in the Ishimura.
Yeah, I was going to say, one of the things is somebody shows up Ellie floats up in a planet cracker, probably the Ishimura, and we retcon how it's still there, and fights the Brethren Moon planet with a planet cracker is required fan service.
But this is why, this is what, gets you and I both so excited about, and when you do this planning, and when you can answer that dramatic question that we posed in Dead Space 1, all the way in Dead Space 4, this is where you get, again, that like MCU level catharsis of just like, we saw our protagonist, we saw his journey all the way through, and at the very end he makes the heroic choice.
It binds it together in really critical way that I think is incumbent upon all entertainment designers. Like, this is what the job is.
Yeah.
And I think if you're just sort of faking it as you go, it's not quite going to resonate because the Christmas tree lights aren't all connected.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's the perfect climax.
Yeah.
And I think you can choose between several endings. A Rainbow Steven Spielberg one would be like, he saves all of humanity and like takes over the hive mind and fixes everything all the way back, including Tal Volantis and all the,
everything, everyone who's
ever a necromorph is turned into, so that would be extremely off-brand, not the thing.
Probably not for Dead Space.
No, not for Dead Space. And so, but since it's franchise ending, you could actually at least declare satisfactorily what happens with humanity.
Right.
Like, enough of us survive to begin. The threat is finally neutralized, and now we know we're safe. And now we can begin to grow again.
Yeah.
Something like that would be acceptable.
Yeah.
Without being like, and you turned the whole planet that you were necromorphing for the whole game back into humans,
and everything's rainbow comes across the screen.
Yeah, you don't need that,
yeah.
And I think it wouldn't be right for Dead Space. But I think you'd want to end on a not gallows note, where it's like, well. In other words, you managed to stop the hive mind. Too bad humanity's also dead. That was the end of the story for everybody. You're like, that's too dark.
Right.
Like, that's too dark.
Dead Space always ends on a very bittersweet and also a little bit of a creepy cliffhanger-y note. So, right, so like, who knows if you'd want to end it on a cliffhanger and be like, oh, maybe Dead Space 5.
Well, what do you do? How do you end a series? I mean, think of MCU. Like, when they killed Thanos, and then that was it.
Well, I mean, clearly Isaac's arc ends here, but that doesn't mean Dead Space ends, right? Obviously, with all the transmedia that you've been a part of. So, maybe Ellie straps on the engineer helmet. She's like, oh, I gotta go save all the other planets or whatever. I don't know. Like, there's some stuff you could do just to be like, hey, the story of Isaac, because again, Dead Space 1, 2, 3, 4 is the story of Isaac.
I say that's the main story of Isaac.
Yes, but then again,
but the universe lives.
Exactly. When you're setting up again like a franchise, it doesn't mean that like it has to end here. We have multiple people that we've introduced. Who knows what you could do.
Well, if you tasked me with figuring out what else to tell, the way that Star Wars does a good job of doing things, the marker phenomenon is a well understood rule set now, and Isaac's shown us the journey from never touching one to neoing them in the hive mind. If our Dead Space 4 holds up, then you could do that in other places in the universe where people are struggling with marker presences, right? And just say that the whole marker network wasn't shut down, and you've got everybody dealing with that, like. You know what I mean? Like different versions of marker encounters. Just keep exploring those.
Yep, exactly. And so there's a million different, when you're dealing with space magic ways. Like maybe he dies in his dying breath. He touches the earth. He touches Ellie, and he's like, "Now you have the power. You must go save the other planets or whatever." I don't know. There's a million things you could do.
I would try that first. I would try to plumb the existing rule set.
Yeah.
And you can maybe do it where you have things like, not this.
Yeah.
Nicole shows up and she's like, well, I was secretly a dyad the whole time, and I've really been, you know what I mean? Like, you have some whole new aspect that was hidden that it gives you a new, rule set to play with. And, I think that cheapens what you understood before. I think you can try to add new rule sets to it, but I would take what just happened. Yeah. If you have to add a rule set and be like, because Isaac just shut down for the first time ever, a hive network, it begets the following things. So you do a franchise, therefore, but.
Yeah, exactly. Even though we've ended Isaac's story, that doesn't mean that there can't be a therefore but for the universe.
And there's a direct consequence of his success. Right. He did something, and then, which is a rare time to use it, but or therefore but, really, it went to something else. And figure out what that means for who. Maybe Ellie would be a logical choice. Like I said, Ben always wanted to make Dead Space 4 be clearly Ellie's fight on Earth to stop the markers from being there. And maybe we would have, because we killed Isaac in Dead Space 3, we literally killed him. Yeah. And then we're like, Dead Space 4, or DLC, he somehow comes back. So, and just as a vignette there, Dead Space 3 DLC, the company stopped caring about us, or like, whatever, do the DLC. So we're like, can we do horror? They're like, sure, who cares what we do? And so that's why that's all pure horror, is because we were allowed to do.
So the
actual story like shows up in DLC for Dead Space 3.
You were able to execute on the narrative idea first without having the constraints put in later of just like, oh, now
even just all the stuff we talked about, the
Yeah.
the embryonic versions of it
Yeah.
are shoved into that DLC to kind of get us what happens. I don't know. Isaac and Carver, and then they get to they get to Earth where the moons are, because that's where we wanted it to end, but we didn't get it. You know, it was all this other stuff. But yeah. No, I think there's lots of good ways to keep the franchise going, and I think the beloved characters can find ways back onto the screen. Right. And who knows what happened with like whoever does Dead Space 3 over again, if they do something with Carver and Norton, I think it's a good chance to make those characters be the pickup characters afterwards, like the next generation of marker fighters would be really smart. Just the same way that Isaac was just busy being an engineer and trying to find his dead girlfriend, encounters the markers. Why can't that be true of Carver, Ellie, and Norton? Right? Why can't they have destinies that suddenly inflect all this? And the new complication is a thing for them to figure out.
Right, exactly. Because there's still, like you're saying, there's still so much fun to be had in the Dead Space universe, you know, whatever there is to be. Like, as long as you're, you know, who knows what you could do from there. Like, maybe you could do like a more Gears of War style tactical Dead Space thing. Maybe not, I don't know, maybe that wouldn't work. But
why do you think that would work, and why would that not work?
It depends. Maybe as I think about it, maybe it wouldn't work, because I think that, like you were saying, that was the problem you had with Dead Space 3, was that it was inherently, the player expectation is that I'm going to be here and be scared, and so.
Well, it's a melee claustrophobic fright crawler.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, it's where you don't have enough information, you're slightly underpowered. It's a zombie crawl. I mean, it's Alien, right? Yeah. And so when you flip it and make it Gears of War, that's a whole other fantasy fulfillment.
It's a different power fantasy.
Totally, 1,000%. Yeah. And people love both, but you can be careful what you prime the audience for. You know, Once Upon a Time versus like, you know what I mean? Whoa, what am I?
It's subverted. It's subverting player expectations in a bad way.
Oh, in the worst possible way. Yeah. You've mispromised. And like, here's my brand. Where is your brand? It's not
exactly.
here. And you're like, oh God. So I think you could do a Dead Space universe in other genres.
Yeah.
If people loved it and wanted that.
But you probably would call it like Shooty Gun Times, a Dead Space story. You know, like,
right?
I
would have to ask the fans for permission to cross over genres. Does the Dead Space world really, like, if you just pasted Dead Space onto Gears of War and instead of the Flood and all that stuff, it was Dead Space stuff,
would it work? Maybe if they were, you know, like you kind of had in Dead Space 3, if they were like fighting Utology or something. I don't know. I think that's where you get into dangerous territory of not knowing who the game is for, because your core audience is going to expect horror. If you're trying to find a new audience, why aren't they just going to play Gears of War? You know what I mean?
Well, that's the trick. Like, I would say, know your audience and what they want, and then that would require you to understand why the Dead Space universe, outside of the specific gameplay genre, it resonates, and be like, I'm gonna express that resonance over here in a Gears of War thing, or over here, like Star Wars, for a good example. Like, that's just the feels of a Star Wars universe do survive translation quite well to KOTOR, right? Or almost anything. Like, your Star Wars is a welcome vibe everywhere all the time.
Yeah.
So same for Dead Space. Is that a vibe that people can replicate in like a good Batman movie? You know,
that's a good question, because, you know, Star Wars is such an expansive universe. Like, you can have the Mandalorian, where it's very clearly a Western. You can have the mainline franchise, which is a space opera. You can have a war movie like, you know, Rogue One or whatever else.
Or Andor. Think of Andor.
Andor, right? Exactly, where it's the political espionage, right? Like, there's so many different genres and sub stories you can tell in Star Wars. Does Dead Space lend itself to that? I don't know.
Exactly. I mean, I can obviously see, like, the marker fight might be perpetual. Like, we would limit the scope of Isaac's success in Dead Space 4 to stopping the Earth threat, the Earth arc, but there's Brethren ruins everywhere. So maybe he didn't shut down the whole network. So the struggles against the necromorph moons are perpetual. So you would have this necromorph ecology you're always fighting. Right. So you've got some fun elements. Insanity, right? You've got, a beachhead. You've got a zombie outbreak constantly happening. That ran Walking Dead for how many seasons? 12 seasons? So you've got some perpetual motion machines available there. The question is, does it survive in a Rick and Morty and an Adult Swim? Does it survive in MMO? Does it survive in Andor?
Yeah.
Would be like, where would you want that setup to be enjoyed, and could it or would it? zombie doesn't really translate. If you notice, it doesn't seem
but
to...
it could potentially, like, I'm thinking about, we obviously talk a ton about Aliens being a big influence for this, and then when you look at the Alien games, like, they had Alien RTSs, they've had Alien, like, strategy games where it's like, you're moving soldiers around, they're shooting the aliens. Some of those have, had limited success, I would say, but they still, they targeted a small audience who likes aliens. So I could easily see, like, a Dead Space, tactical strategy game, right, where you're, like, moving people around, like Final Fantasy Tactics or something like that, or like that could potentially be something that works, where you're a bunch of Marines or whatever fighting a bunch of necromorphs. I don't know.
But this question is really pertinent too, to think of the horror genre itself. Think of Alien and the struggles it had to go beyond. It never did the first movie ever again. It did the second movie and then stopped finding success because it couldn't establish the resonance again and again and again, mostly because you just can't keep doing the exact same first movie, and so that might come to be a problem for Dead Space. Like, well, what are you repeating? Like, is it a sense of dread? So I don't know. I think if you could extract that essence into a actionable log line that you can shoot at other things, then maybe see if it worked. But it's a challenge.
It is a big challenge. It's interesting because, when we were talking about Dead Space 3 and kind of the genre dissonance and the narrative dissonance that was going on there, it's interesting when you, exactly like you said with Alien, where, or, think of Jaws or however, where there's like Jaws 12 or whatever, where it's like there's a level at which the audience will appreciate a sequel or like more additions to the franchise, but there's a level where there's a point at which that becomes banal, where it's just like, this is what's expected, we don't want more of the same thing, give us something new. Think of Breath of the Wild, right? It's just like, they kept kind of doing the same formula with Zelda, and then they had to switch it up, but it still felt like Zelda, but it was a reimagining. So trying to find that balance of giving the audience what they expect, but still surprising and delighting them and just subverting their expectations in a good way, finding that balance is so hard, especially when you're kind of in a more of a specific niche genre like Dead Space.
Like, well, horror. I would argue the MCU did a world, like, epic historical just amazing version of conjugating that hair slice over and over and over again. Like, what was the first 4 phases, like 20 something movies? All of them are just, it's like you knew what you were getting when you went in, and they always delivered. It was almost a Pixar quality effort every time. And they had little tiny variations of the theme. Like, the main Avengers movies was going to be this. It was, Joss Whedon in his good days, who was himself channeling the original Star Wars. And then they're like, okay, a little more serious with Captain America. And then we went over here, and then we tried to, the Thor didn't work twice. And the third one, they're like, what if it's kooky? And then the Guardians of the Galaxy was even more kooky. So they found a funnel to be in. DC never found it, because they couldn't ape Marvel's success, but they probably should have figured something out like that. Star Wars also failed its own premise. Like, they never got off the ground after, like, the first 2 movies. They fell back into some weird space. So it can be done. Like, you can find a formula and do a little bit of a variant of it. Because are you unhappy with how many Avengers movies were there? 3?
Oh, there's more. It depends on how you count.
I mean, the Avengers. It's the first Avengers, and then there's
Avengers. Then there was Age of Ultron.
Age of Ultron.
But then there was Civil War, which was Captain America, but it was mostly Avengers.
Oh.
And then there was then Infinity War.
Then Infinity War. So there's like roughly 4 or 5. Ish. I would argue those didn't get tired, and everyone keeps saying, like, I got superhero fatigue. I've got this fatigue. I'm like, actually, no. Marvel proved you can execute that formula forever, and I would argue the latest phase of Marvel is just bad movie execution. Like, you can look at those, and those are missing the magic of the previous ones. They aren't the same quality movies that people got tired of. They are not as good movies. And I
think, when we say not as good movies, I think there's obvious for multiple reasons why that could be. People talk about plot holes, or maybe it's just like the scenes are just kind of drawn out. But this is why we specifically wanted to have this talk about Dead Space, the entire arc of Dead Space being about Isaac Clarke. Like, this is the story about Isaac Clarke. And when you look at, they've done that, there's a web of that they do across all of Marvel, or all of the MCU. But when you're talking about, like, Infinity War and Endgame, I would argue that those are the stories of mostly Tony Stark and a little bit of Captain America, right? Like, almost all of those are the main characters, which is why they have such, when you look at the end of Endgame, because you can analyze how that ended, it was, spoilers, Tony dies, right? Which was his whole arc of being a selfish narcissist the entire series, and he finally makes the ultimate sacrifice of his life. And then at the end of Endgame as well, Chris Evans, who's always trying to sacrifice himself, he doesn't swear, he's trying to be the perfect hero, he becomes selfish and he leaves all of his friends to go live a perfect life with his girlfriend or wife or whatever. So that they have opposing arcs, but that is how both of them learn from each other, and that is the end of Endgame. There's a million other characters who go through a bunch of other arcs there, but when you're looking at that first chunk of everything from the first Iron Man all the way to Endgame, it is mainly the story of mostly Tony Stark and then obviously Captain America as well. Like, those are the main characters that are in there.
I think that's true, and I would even go so far as to say that is a necessary but not sufficient condition for the success. So yes, if that's missing, and you can look at the later stuff that we're in right now, and it's missing the core characters.
Yeah, it's
maybe.
like, who am I supposed to be following?
But that's a high-level design concern. What I think those movies are failing at the execution.
Yeah,
which is not good movie craft.
But you also can't. I feel like you could. It's probably harder to execute well when you don't necessarily have high level franchise.
I don't disagree, but what I think. I will be forever struck by the lesson of the first Iron Man and the first Avengers.
Yeah.
Because Marvel had farmed out all the good franchises, the good ones. X-Men, Fantastic Four.
Which were the popular comics.
Those are the popular
Iron
comics.
Man was not super popular.
I mean, it was an Iron Man? Are you kidding me? Like, it was they had the scraps on the table.
They kind of farmed out as well to Sony.
Can you imagine someone hands you, okay, here's what you need to do. I need you to make a great movie. You get to work with the Hulk, 2 failed movies. You have to work with Iron Man, the Black Widow, Hawkeye?
Yeah.
Come on. And then, like, is it like, that's like trying to win with one arm tied behind your back. And then Thor, like a Shakespearean curtain rod wearing Carol Burnett character. Right. You're like, what? Like, that is a hopeless task.
Yeah.
That, I'm telling you, the execution saved and made those characters, like Hawkeye and Black Widow, you can't be serious. Like, that's, how do you write with those? And they did it despite all the best bets being off somewhere else at Fox Studio and all these other places, right?
Yeah.
To me, that's the same thing. It's the exact same problem. Like, they got into this new phase, and it's just a craft problem. Yeah. It's not a materials problem.
Yeah.
I'm going to argue. Because they proved that with the Sow's ear, they made Silk's purse.
Yeah.
Right? And so I always think the magic lies in the directing and the writing, and you can make arguably a bad bet turn around.
What does that mean for Dead Space, right? Like, if we have seen how, something like, we relate it back to the MCU just because I think that's the most recent franchise that, you and I can both think of, where it's dozens of properties that are, at least up into the point of around Endgame, were executed quite well, quite
the
spectacular.
Entire suite of them executed flawlessly.
Yeah.
So why, and why not now? Because they're not doing it now. And Star Wars has never done that.
Right.
Right?
I don't know. It's a good question.
Well, I think that's why I was bringing up the example of the really awful material they had to start with Avengers, those awful characters.
Right.
Like, that's not
because
a promising start, and they managed to make it work.
Yeah, and I think what we've talked about this a lot, where people, and I've even said this before to you, where it's like my original analysis of why the current Marvel movies weren't as gripping as I was like, well, they don't have a Thanos character. And you hear a lot of people say that, like, well, there is no larger plot that they're fighting against. But to your point, which makes sense, you're like, no, it's just an execution problem. You can still have a main character that goes through a compelling arc and tells the story in one film that has nothing to do with the greater existential plot threads that have to do with the entire franchise, which I agree with you with.
I mean, you have to make a good movie, and it can be of a larger plot thing, but those don't make it a good movie.
Exactly.
You have to be able to craft it. And so, I don't know. I mean, if you look at, like, Strange and the Mysteries of Madness, now that...
Oh, yeah, Doctor Strange.
Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, that was actually, I heard they were trying to film it in 2020. Oh. And they had a way more much bigger aspirations for almost everything, and people couldn't film and all these things, so they end up with a tattered set of, like, they just suffered Hurricane 2020. So it's not fair to judge it as much, but everything else subsequent to that has just not there. And I don't think it's because, I mean, if they could have done it with those characters they started with, they can do it with any other characters. And I just think they have just struggled to put together good movies. I don't know, and it's hard to make good movies. So
and so that brings us back to Dead Space, which is like, let's say for some reason, Dead Space was super financially viable and they wanted 1 million Dead Spaces, right? Like, in that world, what would be the play? Would you be able to be like, all right, well, here's a bunch of single player horror games, maybe here's one with Ellie, maybe here's a side story with Norton, or here's one with Carver, whoever else, right, is in, as characters in the franchise.
Absolutely. Yeah, if we were designing that from scratch, I would just split up abilities.
Yeah.
Across, let's start with 5. Norton, Ellie. Sorry. Norton, Carver, Ellie, Nicole, Isaac. And their reaction to the marker, just like Isaac's was very specific, is very specific. Giving them very specific weaknesses can give them a personality that calibrates against what's happening to them, and very specific powers. And that then, throw that into the break the story mix, and you're like, okay, now you're over here at, Europa, where this is happening, and now this is the type of facility that's there. This is the current state of the relationship to EarthGov and Unitology. Like, give them a place to have all this stuff in, and cook up a story there where they're like fighting all these things while trying to fight the zombie force of nature. And they've got all these other different things. So you've got these different flavors of superheroes, essentially.
Yeah.
Fighting.
When we're talking about why Dead Space has not historically been financially viable in a lot of cases, versus something like Dead by Daylight, which is still a very popular, moderately, at least to the point where they're still making content for it, which is multiplayer horror, which is like you're chasing 4 of your friends around as the bad guy and you take turns, right? So there's a lot of fun and there's financial viability there. You can sell new characters and all this to keep the kind of live service going. But Dead Space currently as a series is just basically single player horror. And so, can you break out of that? Potentially, maybe.
I don't know, Brian.
I would argue you could. Like, if you think of, I was going to contradict my own self, but like, you could make a game where you're playing as Nicole at the beginning of the outbreak, and you're doing Alien Isolation style, where you can't even fight the necromorphs, and you're just hiding in lockers, right? Like, that could be really fun, but that would be single player horror. But maybe you could do one where you're yeah, exactly. But I'm like, you could do that. They could do a multiplayer one where maybe your friends play as necromorphs or whatever else could do.
It's always going to be, I think you're right. Like, can you jump the genre with the setting that you have, capital S setting, and do people want to come to the Dead Space world in a big multiplayer shoot 'em out, like a Destiny scale thing?
Yeah.
Like, is that what people want? Like, they always want, people love the genres and all different types. Is your franchise IP welcome to express there? And would the audience come seeking it? You know what I mean? Because or in other words, is the Dead Space IP so bound to single player horror the way Alien proved that it was and could never grow out of the first movie? Like, it wasn't welcome anywhere else. And would that be true of Dead Space? Are we so bound to that even if I give you a cool necromorphology and an EarthGov and blah blah blah, all these cool things and ghosts and insanity, is it welcome somewhere else? People are like, why isn't this single player horror? Why is this anything other than that? You will face that question, and if you can survive the gauntlet and get there, then the franchise can expand.
I think you can. I think it's just, it's again player expectations, because I think if you call it Dead Space 3 and there's no horror,
maybe that was the problem.
It's just like right. But if you called it Carver's story, a Dead Space series, whatever, like a Dead Space story, like maybe that would have been okay, because players like, this isn't Isaac, and it's not a mainline Dead Space game, so it could be fun.
That might have been the death knell. Like, it tried to publish in the vein of Dead Space 3 as a Dead Space, which is a single player horror game, the first two, and trying to be the third of a thing and not be that is death. If you came over here and say, not Dead Space, MMO or MOBA or card trading game, everyone's going to come expecting that genre of game with this IP.
Right.
So I think there's a just real basic marketing understanding there, and like product position decisions that you'd have to see. We'd have to be way more successful to be able to test those things out to see. But I think the lore is rich enough to support all kinds of conjugations. I mean, we did with Transmedia. Like, it literally survived Transmedia because I'm opening a novel not expecting a single player horror game.
Yeah, exactly. 100%.
It's a novel.
Yeah. And I think this is this is why we wanted to make this video and specifically broke it down in this way, is because when you're talking about like breaking a franchise, when you're talking about creating an IP, we're both narrative nerds, so we love talking about the story of it, but there's also so much excitement from, like, you've created a new world here, you've created a new IP, there's limitless stories you can tell, there's so many characters you can tell the story about, but that, obviously means that there's still an execution standpoint too, where it's like, we have all these great ideas, right? How do we make this real? And that could even be as simple as setting player expectations maybe not calling it Dead Space 3, but calling it something else,
Right.
would have maybe made it a little bit easier for players to accept what that game was.
Right.
Or whatever.
I would love to see what that happened if you just went out with, this is not Dead Space 3, it story-wise is, but this is action.
Yeah.
An action game. This is a Drake's Uncharted game. This
Yeah.
is a thriller set in the Dead Space universe.
Yeah.
Then people that wanted that experience in a Dead Space world would have come, as opposed to people wanting Dead Space and not getting anything close to it.
Yeah.
There's just a lot. I mean, there's really, I say basic product positioning and marketing, but
It's hard.
it is often, especially when you're making the game,
Yeah.
like you tend to be like the old car makers in Detroit were like, look, we make the metal and you buy the metal.
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't think that's how that's working anymore.
Yeah,
you have to be a little
exactly.
more consumer focused. So.
Yeah, well, it's also just there's so many moving parts when you're talking about like a large franchise. It's like when you're talking from like a business standpoint, again, how is this going to be financially viable? How much money can we invest in this? What people do you have who are making the narrative calls versus the like higher level franchise goals? Are they the same people?
Right.
What is the team executing on this? Blah, blah, blah. There's so many pieces that have to come together to make it a whole thing. Make us whole, huh? Wow, he said it! But, God damn it. But
Well-
that is where, and this is why, you know, it's hard to do this stuff, and it's hard to make sure that all these things come together, and this is why you need to have such an aligned team, and to make sure that like at all moments be like, this is what we're doing, guys, this is what we're doing, we're still going, we're marching along. And anytime you have pieces come into there that's like, hey, gotta take out the horror, hey, we actually need to add co-op, hey, like all of these different things can jostle the formula around, and sometimes the plane is trying to land while you're putting wheels on it and adding wings.
Well, it's the fact that the plane is going at all is always the problem there, because do you know what I mean? You're
Yeah.
like, it's 500 miles an hour, and so you're like, we're going to make Dead Space 3, and what seems like the innocent adjustment to be like, by the way, don't make it horror, just make it action.
Yeah.
Like, well,
What are we doing?
where is the meeting where someone stands up and says that is the biggest possible deviant? Like that, what you mean to say is let's not market this or position this as what it was. That's incomprehensible. No one's going to say that or even action on that.
Or-
you're going to just make this mistake.
Yeah, or it's like then you need to have an entire discussion of, okay, well then what is, that's like a massive 90-degree turn
Right.
of what the product is.
Well-
You could still do it, but you need to understand like, okay, this is not a mainline Dead Space game anymore, or if it is, players are going to get upset.
The reality is that, and you're sitting in these exact meetings, and it's like, hey, these tens of millions of dollars you've just reoriented, and we have to
Yeah.
talk about it in that light. Do you instead want to say this is a game EA's making that's this other genre that makes more money,
Yeah.
and we're doing this IP? But weirdly, it's like magnets being too close together. Like you can't separate some of these things out in the heat of the moment as you go, and you go all the way to publishing with it. And so it's really difficult to look
Right.
at this stuff from the root
Yeah.
and recalibrate the multi-million-dollar decisions, right?
Right.
It's like, boo. Because then it's like, should we do it at all?
Right.
You're all the way back to the beginning. You're like, well, no, if I want to spend, tens of millions of dollars, I don't know that I want to do that.
Yeah, because it'd be like if someone was like, hey, make an alien game but no xenomorphs. And it's like, well, it's like, okay,
Right.
we can, but like we need to have a serious discussion of like what that even is. Is it even alien anymore? Like what
Well,
is
that's
it?
the whole point.
Yeah.
Well, that's what happened with like, well, I mean,
Because then you're talking about like, again, is it in the same world? Maybe, but again, you need to figure out what the product is, because you've so significantly changed the core of identity of the product.
right, because you're after what? You're after the fan base and the equity that it has.
Because you could say like,
But
hey,
if you don't,
make a game like, or make a movie like Alien, and it's like, cool, we can do that with The Thing or Jaws or whatever. Those are similar formulas.
Right.
But if you said make an Alien movie without the alien, that's a weird way to phrase it, because now you're like, well, what the fuck are we doing here?
But then what happens is that when those decisions get made, it just turns into an execution play. They're like, look, it'll be fine, just don't make a bad movie.
Just make it good.
But you're like, look, there can be high level concepts that wreck where we're going. Like it's set up to fail. But let's just take the Motive remake, for example, though. Like that was perfectly laser clear, and they knew exactly everything. There wasn't a question anywhere in that, and they
Yeah.
had the right budget and the right time and the right everything, and that was like an astounding success.
Right.
That just shows you, as long as you're not messing with the high concept, set me up to succeed problems,
Yeah.
then the execution can be left alone, and if it's good, then you're good to go.
Right.
But you got to not blow the top in.
Exactly. And I think that's the problem. And it's like, we say all of this not to say that like there's, I think it's easy to think, like, imagine like some evil businessman in a suit being like, "Meh, meh, meh, make more money, fucking blah, blah, blah." Like, that's almost always not how it works, where it's just like, hey, we, our market position has changed, our financials are different this year, we need to make this pivot, help. A lot of just and sometimes these are just too late. It's like, hey, we have to ship this in 6 months, but also, sorry, we have to pivot in this way, right? Like, so it just it happens in game development, and movies too, for what it's worth, but it happens in games specifically all the time.
You and I swim within these waters constantly of what is it we're supposed to be making, and sometimes it gets into these strange places, but I'm excited to see what Motive is going to do for the next step. They have a lot of great options,
hopefully
right?
they can, continue the series, so I think the players
right.
would really enjoy that. And we would love to see it as well.
After the remake, actually I want to play the remake again. It was so well done.
Yeah.
I want to see what's going on with the rest of it.
Yeah, but they did a really, really great job.
Yeah, that must have been really very satisfying too for Joe and the writers to think of all those things and find a way, like finding a solution in such a broken, complicated problem space is so gratifying. And they had really great answers across all of it, and the scenes they added were so great.
When you were saying too that they very clearly did their research, like they very clearly knew the franchise and the narrative so well that they could suture up very tactically some of these things, where even you look back when we saw it when we were doing the playthrough, where you're like, oh, why did we do that? Why did I do that? Like,
yeah, I was like, bleh. No, they did. I think they consumed every bit of Dead Space lore that there was.
Yeah.
And because there are references in the first Dead Space that they remade to almost every piece of transmedia property. Right. Like Alyssa Vincent gets some crazy side character in an animated feature gets a reference in it. And the whole, I don't know, because as you know, when we built the different properties to be transmedia to come into Dead Space 2, like Richard Briggs' character, the guy who opens Dead Space 2 and gets stabbed, he's the star of the phone game, I think, or a different game. Like that kind of stuff. Like you understand how the sprawl comes to be infected with the who does the outbreak and why. Those are all little mini stories that populate that stuff, and they use those characters and those references in their remake, right?
Yeah.
So the benefit of all that hindsight is really great. So I hope they just take Dead Space, the whole that is Dead Space 3, and they just be like, this is what we're going to do. And they do some other love letter to it.
Yeah.
No, that's a big ask because, dude, I don't know what they did. If they had the asset base of Dead Space 1 and they just up-res them, or if they just rebuilt the sets.
I feel like they probably just rebuilt most of it. I would
surely you would just rebuilt the set, right?
Yeah, they could potentially. We were talking about like, what would happen if they're like, just kidding, we're not going to do Dead Space 3, we're going to do this differently or whatever to make it again more what players expect. I think, but you don't want to discount, because I'm sure there were still many players who were like, and you see it in the comments too, a lot of players are like, oh, I like Dead Space 3, I thought it was pretty fun, right? And you don't want to discount their experience. But it would just come down to expectation, right? Dead Space 3, director's cut, redux, whatever. Like, just be like, oh, it's different.
Well, I was going to say, we live in a multiverse era now, and thank God for Rick and Morty. Like, people got so quickly educated on the real fine hair splitting of what you and I were conversant in 20 years ago. Now everyone knows multiverse. This is just the Kelvin universe.
Right.
Like Star Trek, just complete Star Trek.
Yeah.
Star Trek. 40 years are like, no, over here. And they just rebirth. Like J.J. Abrams just said, here's another universe. And they had an in-frame thing with the big, was it a Romulan ship comes through a time warp and suddenly everything is different. They split the universe off to tell a different story.
Just do that again.
I'm in. Yeah, it's like that's one Dead Space universe. This is another Dead Space universe.
Yeah.
Right. And I don't even know if you need anything in the frame to say. You're like, this is,
you just accept it. You just be like, it's fine. As long as you make it clear to the players, just like,
yes, exactly. Just say it's an alternate timeline or whatever. Who cares? Like, it's just.
And because you could say that because it's like Dead Space Remake was not clearly word for word. They added a bunch of stuff. They changed a bunch of stuff, and it's just like, cool, you made it
without even addressing it.
Yeah.
They just said, here's the remake.
Yeah.
And it gets an upgrade.
So you could say, here's Dead Space 3 Remake. Beep boop. Like, you could do whatever you want.
I totally agree. I'm not sure you're really obligated at this point, people get retcons, and I think remake buys you a pretty big ticket of stuff you can do. Right. And if you feel if you're just going to throw away Dead Space 3, except for the lore,
keep that.
Then I think you might be able to. You could do remake territory, but like, really, who cares? Just like, we own Dead Space now. We're going to make the franchise continue, and we're going to do a solid, on-brand version of the single-player horror for franchise.
Well, they clearly know how to execute too, because they did such a great job.
Well, and to be fair, you mentioned like the MCU and stuff. I think people have learned in serialized content now that it's because it's serialized and not episodic, meaning it's a narrative and it's got beats and things are consumed and you go past points of no return and it's not the same state.
Yeah.
You progress. That is a finite thing. So that's why entire franchises only last like, 4 seasons. Like, they have a finite life. They don't just try to keep going forever because they know they can't milk it forever.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So knowing that about a franchise like Dead Space, I would say, cap it at some number and then close it out.
Right.
So that satisfaction happens, and don't try to just keep going forever.
Right.
That's
exactly.
Not good.
And especially like we were saying, like, if you're going to kick it off with a protagonist like Isaac, hopefully the players in the audience will expect and hope for a nice bow end, like we've talked about, of like, this is where we started, this is where he went, and this is the end that answers the question that we set up in the very beginning. Mm-hmm. And also with the I had a point and it's going to come to my brain. Oh, with the multiverse thing too. It's just like like we were saying with Marvel and all the different movies, it's like people will accept more or less whatever as long as it's a good story. And when we say good story, it means it has compelling characters that go through a change, that have an arc, that have a satisfying end. Yeah. And obviously then you can have a lot of fun along the way of whatever hijinks you want to do, and goofy moments and funny quips and whatever else.
Right.
Fun horror moments, scary, terrifying moments. But that spine of what we've talked about today needs to be there, of just like, this is the story of this character who has this specific question that we set up, and then he goes through a bunch of fun, scary things to the very end. That is what people expect, and I think a lot of people who may not have like narrative training or may not have narrative experience think you know it. And that's what's so fun about being an audience member and being able to consume so much media we have these days. Is everyone, I think, has a voice, because you can feel it when a movie satisfies you, when it moves you, when you relate to these characters. You know it. You don't have to say what we talked about with all of our narrative verbiage of like therefore buts and arcs and whatever else, franchise IP stuff. But you just know that it spoke to you, and you felt that satisfying conclusion and that excitement of the characters that you're seeing on screen or that you're playing. But people know it. Like, people can feel it, and that's why it's the...
Yeah, they can't articulate what the design is.
But everyone knows it, and that's what's so fun.
You won't find any of your favorite movies that don't.
Right.
Follow at least the basics, and then also execute.
Yeah.
On them well.
Right. And that's what's so fun about like being involved with narrative and being narrative nerds, is because we're so passionate about that, because we've been so moved and so inspired by games that we've played or protagonists we've seen on screen, that we want to help shepherd that for more people, right, and help inspire more people and help move more people, which is why we've done this entire breakdown today, is not to like critique or even criticize. It's to say like, this is something that we feel would do Isaac justice and would do the players justice. Of, again, this is just us pontificating. Who knows what motive could eventually do or whatever. That's all fine. This is what we talk about as narrative nerds.
Well, this is what we I mean, a beloved franchise.
Yeah.
Like, oh, how could it be great?
Yeah.
And this is the answers for what you could do if you do a remake, right?
Yeah.
Do you think, I don't know if it would be true, like the James Bondification of a hero, mm-hmm. like, those are magic shoes you get into. He's unreal. He's hyper powerful mm-hmm. and aspirational. It's always some Bond villain. It's always some cool gadgets. Like there's a promise that you get when you go to the movies.
Yeah.
He's going to be kind of a casual badass,
right?
Who hardly even has to try and gets all the women, blah blah blah. And like, is that available to Ripley and to Isaac?
I don't know. I think you can go from a archetypal like person like James Bond. You could go from an archetype to the later James Bonds, where he has actually a small amount of an arc. Like, he's got a decent arc. He goes through some character changes in the more recent series with
the Daniel Craig one started to be more modern writing.
Exactly. But I don't think you can go in reverse. I don't think you could have Ellen Ripley, who has a pretty strong character arc and who is the strong protagonist, and then go to something more flat where she's just a badass who's just doing all the badass things?
No, I'm just thinking like the setup with both Isaac and Dead Space 1 and Ripley and Aliens 1 is they are underpowered, and against all the odds they persevere. And you just keep that exact note for every movie that comes out. I'm going to throw Isaac back into another place where, oh no, another zombie outbreak. Because with Bond, it's like, oh, okay, he's going to go up against another villain, and all that matters is the different.
And you just know he's going to save the day in some
Well, the only dramatic question in the old Bond movies was how is he going to defeat this villain? Not will he?
Yeah.
You don't come expecting him not to do it.
You don't go to see James Bond to watch him lose.
No, and you don't even go to James Bond expecting him to grow. Like he's already where you come to watch these. It's magic. You come to watch Superman. You come to watch a big wrestling match, and your guy's going to win.
Yeah.
So. That's why I don't know if that applies to the horror characters, because like, why are they always so underpowered? Oh my god, stop being so weak. Like the whole point of it is like this, it's overwhelming odds, and through grit and wit they succeed.
Right.
And like, okay, am I just going to keep throwing him into necromorph weirdness? That's why it was hard to conjugate the Alien movies, right? They couldn't just keep doing the first one.
Yeah, I think it does. I
Really?
think it does work. But I think it comes down to, again, their emotional arc, and I also think it comes down to, because, you could say that one of the themes is like, someone defeating the odds in overwhelming circumstances, right, or whatever.
But that's what I'm asking. What if there's no arc? Like, that's what made the Bond movies, the originals had no arc, right? The MCU people kind of do, but the MCU's on the upper side of the power gradient. There's a magic shoes again.
Yeah.
I want to see superheroes superheroing.
Yeah.
A horror protagonist, horror protagonisting. Like think of maybe the Halloween ones. Like Jamie Lee Curtis keeps getting in trouble. Like, do you want to keep seeing that? Like, at what point?
It depends. I think it. I think it depends on what your expectations are, because you set James Bond up to just be this guy who's just going to be this quippy badass who gets all the girls and saves the day, and that's kind of it. You know what to expect. Like another one that we've talked about is like Godzilla, right? It's just like Godzilla doesn't really have an arc. He's just a giant monster, but you show up to the movie because you just want to watch a giant monster stomp around and have a good time, right? And those are fun movies. Like those are totally fine. It's not like Godzilla has a deep character arc and an emotional change he goes through. He's just a big monster and you have a good time. But if Godzilla had emotional arc in the beginning and people go to see Godzilla go through this growth or James Bond go through this growth, and then you have the next one where it's just a flat character who's just kind of a badass, you might have people be like, why are they like a Mary Sue now, or why are they just so flat? That's just what people don't expect.
I just think the genre doesn't suffer repetition well, because immediately you question, how does this person keep being so unlucky? James Bond's not unlucky.
Yeah.
Like, that's his motherfucking job, is to go out as MI6 and find and confront when these things arise.
Yeah.
And he's equipped to do it, and they're just a little bit more powerful because they're villains, and though he's the power gradient. Like, if Isaac kept having to go out and fight necromorphs, well, he's at least going to be Dead Space 2 power. Like, he's not going to go out unexpectedly on a ship and have to make do with the things. I mean,
so you're talking about like basically power creep of like, as he grows as a character, does it feel cheap to make him always on the back foot, or does he need to grow in power?
I mean, it's the Star Wars problem. Like, they can't escape Rebel and Empire
Yeah.
configuration. And a horror, Ripley and Isaac can't escape surprise life-threatening crisis, make do with things. Like, how many times does that becomes laughably serendipitous if it keeps repeating itself, versus Bond, whose job is to go up against supervillains. What's the job today?
Yeah.
So this circumstance is very difficult to replicate, which is why you didn't see Alien 1 being Bonded.
Well, I think it's because it's
James Bonded.
It's kind of more, I don't know if it's more serial or less serial, but it's like in Dead Space it's very clear, at least from Dead Space 2, because it's okay that you could just kick it off, be like, there's a bigger problem here. Like, defeating the necromorphs on the Ishimura didn't stop the necromorph problem. Defeating the marker on what's the station in Dead Space 2?
The Sprawl.
The Sprawl didn't stop the problem. You're fighting bigger problems because you need to escalate the stakes, but you're never stopping the problem. So in James Bond, it's a little bit that through line isn't as clear because it's like because you defeated this bad guy, this new
I know
bad guy shows
there's
up.
always some fun, fresh one.
Yeah, exactly. It just kind of comes out of nowhere. At least in the older ones, and the newer Daniel Craig ones, they did kind of try to tie.
They turned it more serialized because that was modern writing.
A little bit more tied together. Yeah.
Well, think about The Walking Dead. Like most zombie apocalypse things, the zombies aren't there to be solved. They're there to create human condition problems, and the problem is always in the human troop.
Yeah.
That's a very established genre, which went for however many seasons because the people were busy boiling around being assholes in a survival apocalypse, right? But that doesn't really apply to the lone protagonist now. So you're like, okay, I just don't know that it's available as much. If Isaac was a James Bond superhero, was overpowered fantasy, then I think you could deploy him. But I think underpowered fantasies consume the underpowered beat instantly and can't repeat.
I don't know if I agree. I think it depends because it depends what you mean by underpowered because I don't view Isaac as underpowered at all. Like I think he's, even though he's just got a mining laser or plasma cutter, it feels really good to blast necromorphs and whatever. Like, and then you have those moments of where he takes control of a big space laser or whatever, and maybe at some point he takes control of the Ishimura like we were talking about. And at the end of Dead Space 4 we were talking about potentially he's like literally controlling necromorphs and controlling moons and pulling them down from the sky.
But that's a progression. I'm saying Bond doesn't have a progression and is repeatable. The horror protagonist, if you're trying to franchise it perpetually, they can't go through a consumable, detectable asymmetry of power to go through an arc
because you feel it'll be too predictable. If it's like
it has to
you're
end.
stuck on another ship again, sucks to suck.
Yeah, if it's always the first. That's the problem. Is this the opening circumstances are serendipitous, and as you know, serendipity gets one knock, one call, and leaves the stage, and so that's what is the horror protagonist's opening. Versus Bond is not serendipitous. He is designed at this role, so which runs every time.
Because they're basically saying, hey, James Bond, we got a problem, go fix it. Yes. Whereas Isaac is just, oh, fuck, I'm in a bad state.
Had I not accidentally...
done blah.
Had I not fallen into this zombie hole, then I wouldn't have trouble.
And then if he became more James Bond, where it's like, there's a necromorph problem, Isaac, go solve it, then
it's a different fantasy.
It is a slightly different fantasy.
He makes the best of... He's wandering along and does the horror movie sin and falls into the bad place. Now you've only got a nightgown and a pencil and your wits. You're like, oh. And the dramatic question is, will you survive? And even though you say he's powerful in Dead Space, it's tuned so that it's much more on its back foot. You're worried about every ammo pack and every health pack and every bullet, like you're conserving its scarcity. And it's not largesse.
That is interesting. Because I'm trying to think of are there any long-running horror protagonists? And after one or two of those, the protagonist either needs to be very powerful, where they can defeat the enemies, which means it's not really horror anymore.
Exactly. See?
Or they need to keep having these oopsie poops. Yeah, I got locked in the room with the monster again.
Jamie Lee Curtis, Halloween.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Or the Scream movies. They keep doing it, but Freddy Krueger movies. The kids keep doing a thing. It does. Or there was one where they had Naomi Campbell or whoever it was. I think she finally was able to fight Krueger. Like she finally went up the arc, but then it's not a horror movie. Yeah. I'm saying the horror genre is the problem. This is why it has a cap. It's emotionally unacceptable not everybody wants to have that feeling. So it just doesn't James Bondify.
You're saying that there is a problem with long-running serialized horror across time.
I'm just saying the genre does not offer itself up to franchising.
Yeah, that is kind of interesting because I even one of my favorites. I love Alien, I love Jurassic Park, but those are all good examples of the more sequels that you have, the more people get tired of it.
Jurassic Park's a great example. Talk about one and done.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so you keep releasing dinosaurs? How stupid do you have to be? You're stuck on the island. Oh, they got loose. Woo. It's accidents.
Yeah.
And not purpose.
Yeah.
James Bond is purpose. Star Trek is purpose. MCU is purpose. These are all like, woof. Oh, things went bad. Oh, look how terrible things are. Those are not... It's because it's serendipity.
Yeah.
It's not okay.
And it's expected to be like, oh, you got to use your wits and the pencil.
Oh, again I have to. What do I have this time? We have a ballpoint pen and gauze and panties. You're like, oh, that's different.
I think that is something that I wonder if games can offer a little bit better than movies, is because you can play the same genre and world again from a different perspective. Like we're saying, like, what if Dead Space, where you have the third person kind of survival shooter like Dead Space is, what if you did an Alien Isolation style where you have no plasma cutter and you're hiding the whole time and it's more of like an escape horror? Or maybe you could do a multiplayer version where your friends are necromorphs and they're scaring you and you have this fun kind of playful moment. Like those are ways that you could play the same horror elements, the same world, maybe even similar characters, just in different ways and seeing it from different perspectives, which could help, again, that's what I think the games can offer.
But those are good examples of available game genres for horror.
Right.
So you could franchise within that.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think it's just, I think, a truth to discover about the horror genre that it's not as... That same protagonist can't keep being in that same situation because
because they'll either become overpowered where it's like, I've been here 12 times before, I gotta grab the plasma cutter and kill the guys, blah, blah, blah.
There's nothing left to tell. You've told it in the first one. There's no other dramatic question. Like, unless the zombies are different this time, now what are you going to do? Oh, is it? Because that's what happens in a Bond movie, is it's a new villain every time.
Yeah.
What isn't in a horror movie? Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Yeah,
is it a big bad every season? That was pretty good, right?
Well, it's usually because then you have it's a question of like, I think like Robert McKee said this, where there's like only a few stories we have where it's like man versus man, man versus nature, man versus culture, I think was one of them. But it's like man versus man.
Man versus himself.
Man versus himself.
Man versus each other. Man versus nature. Man.
So I think like Bond is man versus man, and that's why it works. Is just because it's like, there's a new villain, you have to figure out what they want, and you have to fight them, and then you win. Whereas horror is, at least in this perspective, is always man versus nature. Aliens is the same way. There's an existential alien that's chasing you, or it's necromorphs that are chasing you. So once you defeat that once or twice, are you going to fight nature again?
Yeah, that's the thing. It's the same premise, and as you change it, it just stops making sense. You're like, now the aliens are this, and so now how is she going to overcome that?
Yeah.
And again, the thing that makes a good horror movie is this person is unexpectedly asked to rise to heroic from nothing, from like Terminator, from like being a waitress to being the savior of the future. That question that requires an arc of the character that is consumable, one and done. Mm-hmm. You can't keep doing that, right? Because if they reach this point, well, then what does it look like to the next one? You're like, no one knows because they've hit the peak.
Yeah.
Neo in the Matrix.
Yeah.
Right. Like what was left to tell there. So.
Yeah. No, that is an interesting question.
I mean, you might want to see them continue to kick ass in the new role, but that's Alien 2.
Yeah, and then that's a little bit less horror and a little bit more action.
It's not horror anymore. They are no longer...
They've transcended the horror, and now they are a badass who's going to fight the aliens.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I think that was forever going to be the problem for Dead Space. Mm-hmm. It's a horror game. Your protagonist started normal dude...
Yeah.
Sarah O'Connor, and rose all the way to defeating them.
Which I think that is good of what we've discussed with Dead Space 4, though, is because he basically becomes Neo, and he does have this massive power fantasy where he's in the Matrix, in the necromorph ecology, and then he destroys it. But then it's like, then it's done. Then that's it.
But look at what we laid out with 1, 2, and 3, 4. He's always on his back foot. He is always, because of his own flaws, he is always underpowered.
Yeah.
The first one, just regular underpowered. And the second one, he's like overwhelmed with stuff, trying to figure out, I made this decision and now it's like all these consequences. And the consequences, and he starts out in a straitjacket on the sprawl. So we still have a horror setting. The third one, what's real? Is this real? Who is this? And then the fourth one, he's like, what is even going on?
What have I done?
How do I fight the unfightable? Now the problem is scaled to infinity. I'm not even here anymore.
Yeah.
And I'm now...
Am I even alive?
Am I even a thing?
Yeah.
And then here's this thing using me as its own destiny. The entire hive mind structure. How do I defeat that? So we've done a nice job of scaling it and keeping him in this horror configuration where he's just... Overwhelming odds. How am I going to use my wits to get there? Which I think is why it works. Mm-hmm. Right? But at some point you reach the limit of...
Right, how many times you can do that.
Yeah.
Well, I think that, I think that's something that games offer, is that you can continue it from these different viewpoints of different game genres, even though it's still horror. You could play around in all these different game genres that players will still appreciate. Now, what story you're going to tell is going to be the problem there. It's like, is this Ellie's story? Is this whatever? And, how annoying is it going to be? Or expected is, Ellie is stuck on a ship now, and she's only got a plasma cutter, like whatever.
Yeah,
but,
right?
I think it could still work. That is again, I think the thing that games will offer that is a little bit more of a boon than just being stuck on the film franchise or from a TV franchise.
Yeah, I don't have to see. Like, I think it's the same. The setup is the same problem, which I think is what we designed well for 1, 2, 3, 4 Dead Space, and then where to go from there. I guess, like I said, it depends on if you're deciding to do a horror genre game or not. Like, that's the biggest problem. Is like, I think that would be my only caveat is don't make horror because it's so limited. Like, it keeps you in a very low cap top end, and so
it is hard to make a larger franchise of horror because it's like we were talking about the viewer base and player base for horror one-off. If you're saying we're just going to make one horror movie is small or one horror game is small, but then if you're like we want to franchise this, we want to make 6 of them. How do you do that? Like you're saying, because the premise is always oops, we're stuck in this thing again, we gotta whatever. Versus if you're gonna do any other thing, like if you're doing action, if you're doing romance, if you're doing whatever else.
Maybe you could do think of Diablo 4. That's pretty macabre. If you want horror elements, but you don't want single player horror, which is the Isaac experience. Yeah. I think you could start with a better genre, and then put horror on it. Yeah. Does that make sense? Okay, you can do that forever.
Yeah, for sure. Because I mean, you could. That is an interesting thing. Is you could. I think the safest one is just to be like, this is a action adventure hero story, and you could do a spin-off like Star Wars has done, where it's like, oh, this is our Western version, this is our political intrigue version, this is our war, World War II version. You do here's a horror version. I don't think Star Wars has any real horror ones.
They don't bother with horror because it's not their.
It's not their real bag.
It's not their thing. You certainly could. I mean, they go as dark. They struggle with the darkness because it's a fake darkness. It was always kind of pulpy.
I think in the Lucas days, they, especially with KOTOR and stuff, they definitely were able to go quite a bit darker. Oh. Like before Disney took over, then Lucas was kind of like whatever. Like a lot of the older Star Wars games, which people really like, they go pretty dark. Like you have Star Killer and in KOTOR, I think it's pretty dark as well. Okay. There's a lot of those older legacy stuff that goes. It's never horror, but it's darker. But then when Disney took over, obviously they're just like, no, it's a kind of a lighthearted romp. Yeah. Thank you for being here, Chuck.
Thanks, Brian, for hosting. I think we covered lots of interesting stuff. It was good to think through all that and cast into what might be and have a good version of Dead Space itself. And it's good to know that the franchise has an available outstanding execution that could happen for it, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's also good to know that there's good arbiters currently of the franchise who obviously care very deeply about it.
I am so tickled that Motive gets it. I hope they get greenlit forever and can make them, and all of us fans can enjoy that work forever and ever. Can we take a moment to appreciate Brian's mustache? Like and subscribe if you like Brian's mustache, because I think it's here to stay.
Thank you, everybody, for watching.
Bye, everybody. Have a good night.